The bustling afternoon inside the cafe was not merely a reprieve from the city heat. It was a sanctuary of mundane sounds, the hiss of steam, the clink of porcelain, and the low hum of anonymous conversations. Do-Yoon Kwon sat at a corner table, a masterpiece of lethal elegance in a crisp white shirt that failed to hide the dark ink snaking up his throat. He looked like a man who owned the silence around him, flanked by a wall of black-suited men who stood as silent sentinels against a world that feared him. If you believe no secret stays buried forever, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to see how this confrontation changes everything. Inside the cafe, the air was thick with the scent of dark-roasted beans and the fleeting sweetness of pastries, a world of luxury that felt miles away from the grit of the sidewalk. Samara Ellington, a woman in her late 20s whose determination was etched into every line of her posture, stepped into the light. Her green jacket was slightly faded, and the colorful, stuffed child's backpack slung over her shoulder was a heavy reminder of the small life she fought for every single day. She wasn't looking for a caffeine fix. She was looking for a ghost. Her gaze cut through the crowd, past the students and the business deals, until it landed on the man in the white shirt. The world didn't stop, but for Samara, it fractured. She didn't see a powerful boss or a criminal legend. She saw the man who had promised her forever before vanishing into the shadows without a word. Ignoring the immediate, predatory shift of the bodyguards, she surged forward, her braided hair swaying with the urgency of years of unanswered questions. She leaned into his space, her face a storm of shock and molten anger. "Do-Yoon!" she called out, her voice raw and shaking with the weight of her truth. The effect was instantaneous. The small porcelain cup in Do-Yoon's hand stopped midair. The invincible boss froze, his eyes wide and devoid of their usual cold calculation as he stared up at the woman he had abandoned. In that single, humanizing second, the criminal empire behind him vanished, leaving only a man paralyzed by the sound of a name he thought he had buried a lifetime ago. Humidity of the afternoon clung to the cafe's glass front, but inside, the air conditioning was a sharp, expensive blade that cut through the city's grime. Samara Ellington barely felt the chill. Her world was measured in the frantic rhythm of a ticking clock and the weight of the colorful, stuffed backpack hanging from her shoulder. Her braids were pulled back, a few stray wisps framing a face that had known too many sleepless nights and too many shifts where exhaustion was simply a luxury she couldn't afford. She was a woman of momentum, a single mother moving with a quiet, fierce determination to ensure a child she loved would never feel the gaps in their bank account. She had stopped in for a simple errand, her mind already 3 steps ahead to the daycare pickup and the grocery list, when the atmosphere of the room shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden, pressurized silence that emanated from the corner booth. Samara's gaze drifted toward the source of the stillness, and the breath she was holding died in her throat. There, draped in the clinical luxury of a white dress shirt, and surrounded by a phalanx of men in black suits, sat a ghost. Do-Yoon Kwon looked exactly as he did in the dreams that had haunted her for years, yet entirely different. The open collar of his shirt revealed the intricate, dark ink of tattoos that climbed his neck like vines, marks of a world she had never known. He sat with a lethal, predatory elegance, a small coffee cup held in a hand that looked like it was used to giving orders of life and death. He was the center of a criminal gravity, a man whose very presence demanded a wide, fearful berth from the other patrons. Samara felt the old anger, hot and jagged, tear through the shock. This was the man who had whispered promises into her hair before vanishing without a trace, leaving her to build a life out of the wreckage of his silence. She didn't see the tattoos or the bodyguards as a warning. She saw them as the reason for her struggle. The invincible boss was mid-sip when Samara surged forward, her green jacket a splash of defiant color against his monochromatic world. She leaned over the table, her shadow falling across his porcelain cup. "Do-Yoon," she said. The name wasn't a question, it was an indictment. The effect was a physical blow. Do-Yoon froze, the cup stopping inches from his lips. The mask of the ruthless Mafia leader didn't just slip, it shattered. His dark eyes, which had been assessing the room with cold calculation, suddenly went wide and glassy with a raw, primal terror. In front of his elite men, the man who held the city in a velvet grip became a boy caught in a lie. He didn't move, he didn't breathe. He simply stared up at the woman he had left behind, his entire empire rendered invisible by the weight of a single name. The air in the cafe didn't just grow quiet, it curdled. The rhythmic clatter of spoons and the low hum of the espresso machine seemed to vanish, replaced by a vacuum of sound that centered entirely on the table where Samara stood. The bodyguards reacted with the synchronized precision of a predatory pack. Two of them stepped forward, their shadows eclipsing Samara, hands moving toward the inside of their dark jackets in a gesture that was as unmistakable as a bared blade. The lead guard, a man with a face like carved granite, reached out to intercept her, his voice a low, dangerous rumble meant to neutralize the threat. But before he could touch her, Do-Yoon's hand shot out. It wasn't a violent movement, but the sheer desperation in it stopped the guards in their tracks. He didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the crowd of onlookers who had turned their heads, frozen in mid-sip. His eyes remained locked on Samara, searching her face with a frantic intensity that bordered on agony. The coffee cup he had been holding finally met the table with a sharp, discordant clack, the dark liquid sloshing over the rim and staining the white tablecloth, a small, dark blemish on his perfect, controlled world. "Stand down," Do-Yoon whispered. The command was barely audible, yet it carried the weight of an absolute law. The bodyguards hesitated, their confusion radiating through the room. They had seen their boss face down rival syndicates without blinking, yet here he was, visibly trembling because a woman in a green jacket had spoken a name they weren't even sure they were allowed to know. Samara didn't flinch at the men surrounding her. She leaned in closer, the colorful backpack shifting against her side, her anger a living thing that refused to be intimidated by his status. To the rest of the world, he was a king of the underworld, a man of ink and iron. To her, he was the coward who had left a hole in her life that no amount of hard work could fill. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy, as the cafe patrons began to realize they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple argument. This was the opening of an old wound, one that threatened to bleed out over the polished floor. Do-Yoon's throat worked as he tried to find his voice, his composure discarded like useless armor. The Ghost of Seoul was gone. In his place was a man forced to remember exactly what he had sacrificed to wear that white shirt. "Samara," he finally breathed, the word caught between a plea and a confession. The sound of her name on his lips was like a serrated edge, cutting through the years of silence and signaling to everyone in the room that the life he had built was about to be torn apart. Do-Yoon's hand remained raised, a silent barrier between his world of violence and the woman who had just shattered his peace. The cafe was a vacuum of held breaths, but outside the glass, the city moved with a predatory indifference. He stood slowly, his movements lacking their usual predatory grace, replaced by a jittery, frantic energy. He leaned toward Samara, his voice a low, jagged rasp that barely cleared the table. "You shouldn't have said it," he whispered, his eyes darting to the windows where the tinted glass of black SUVs waited. "Not here, not in front of them." Samara's laugh was short and bitter, a sound of pure defiance. "I've spent years saying your name to empty rooms, Do-Yoon. I wasn't going to stay silent today." "Listen to me," he urged, stepping closer until she could smell the expensive tobacco and the familiar, heartbreaking scent of the man he used to be. "Every man in this room with a suit is mine, but every man watching through those windows belongs to someone else. They were looking for a crack in my armor. They were looking for a reason to believe I'm human, and you just gave it to them." The weight of his words began to settle in the air, heavier than the humidity outside. Samara looked at the bodyguards, noticing for the first time that they weren't looking at her with annoyance, but with a clinical, terrifying focus. They were calculating her value not as a person, but as leverage. "They will take you, Samara," Do-Yoon said, the reality of the threat finally steadying his voice into something lethal. "They will take you and the child whose bag you're carrying just to see if I'll burn the city down to get you back. And the answer is yes, I would. That makes you the most dangerous thing in my life." He reached out, his fingers ghosting near her arm but not daring to touch, as if he were already a monster capable of tainting her. You came here for the truth. The truth is that the moment you called my name, you ceased to be a ghost from my past and became a target for my future. You cannot go back to that apartment. You cannot go to that daycare." Samara's grip tightened on the colorful backpack straps until her knuckles turned ashen. "You don't get to tell me where to go. You lost that right when you left us." "I'm not telling you as the man you loved," Do-Yoon said, his face hardening back into the mask of the Mafia boss, though his eyes remained desperate. "I'm telling you as the man who is currently the only thing standing between you and a windowless van. You are mine now, Samara, not by choice, but by necessity. If I don't claim you as my own, as my wife, before we walk out that door, you won't survive the night." Before she could scream her refusal, he turned to his lead guard, his voice ringing out with an iron authority that brooked no argument. "Secure the perimeter. Inform the council. The lady and the child are coming home to the estate. She is under my personal protection. She is my wife." The transition was a blur of tinted glass and high-speed silence. Samara sat in the back of the armored SUV, her arm wrapped tightly around her daughter, Maya, who was blissfully distracted by the colorful backpack in her lap. Outside, the familiar, weathered streets of their neighborhood, the peeling paint of the laundromat, the cracked sidewalk she had walked 1,000 times, melted away. In their place rose the iron-wrought gates of an estate that felt less like a home and more like a fortress. When the heavy doors of the SUV opened, the air changed. Gone was the city's scent of exhaust and rain, replaced by the sterile, expensive fragrance of cedar and polished stone. Samara stepped onto the heated driveway, her scuffed boots clicking against pristine marble. She felt like a blemish on the landscape. Her faded green jacket, which had always been her shield against the world's coldness, now looked like a rag against the backdrop of the towering glass and steel structure. Do-Yoon walked ahead of them, his pace brisk and his posture rigid. He didn't look back, but the way he tilted his head to listen for their footsteps betrayed his focus. He led them through a foyer that felt larger than Samara's entire apartment. The walls were lined with art that cost more than she would earn in 3 lifetimes, and the floors were so clean they reflected her face like a mirror, a face that looked exhausted, angry, and utterly out of place. "This is your wing," Do-Yoon said, stopping before a set of double doors. He finally turned, and for a second the mask of the Mafia boss flickered. He looked at Maya's bright, plastic backpack and then at Samara's defensive stance. The contrast was a physical ache. In her world, wealth was an extra shift or a full fridge. In his, it was a weapon used to build walls high enough to keep the devil out. The room behind the doors was a masterpiece of gold accents and silk linens, bathed in the soft, artificial glow of recessed lighting. There were no chipped mugs here, no flickering light bulbs, no sound of the neighbor's television through paper-thin walls. There was only the heavy, oppressive weight of total security. Maya ran to the floor-to-ceiling window, pressing her small hands against the glass. "Mommy, we're in the clouds," she whispered. Samara stood in the center of the room, refusing to sit, refusing to let go of her shoulder bag. She looked at Do-Yoon, who remained in the doorway, the light catching the dark ink on his neck. He was offering her a golden cage to save her life, but as she looked around at the cold perfection of the estate, she realized the price of his protection was her reality. She was no longer just a mother fighting for a future. She was a piece of his world now, an inhabitant of the Golden Bastion, where the air was thin and the silence was more terrifying than the storm she had left behind. The following evening, the vast estate felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb, its silence broken only by the muffled chime of high-tech security sensors. Samara moved through the hallway with the cautious grace of someone trespassing in a dream. She reached the door of the library, a cavernous room of dark oak and leather, and stopped. The door was slightly ajar, casting a warm, amber sliver of light onto the marble floor. Inside, the man who had frozen the city with a single glance was sitting on the edge of a velvet ottoman. He had discarded his tailored jacket, and his white sleeves were rolled up, exposing the dark, intricate dragons that spiraled around his forearms. But those lethal hands weren't gripping a weapon or a glass of scotch. They were carefully holding a small, battered picture book Maya had insisted on bringing from the apartment. Maya was perched beside him, her small, dark hand resting trustingly on his ink-stained arm. She was pointing at a drawing of a lopsided house, her voice a soft murmur of toddler logic. Samara held her breath, waiting for Do-Yoon to grow impatient or cold. Instead, he leaned in, his profile softening in a way that made Samara's heart ache with a sudden, violent familiarity. "The house stays standing," Do-Yoon said, his voice dropping into a low, rhythmic hum that Samara remembered from a lifetime ago, before the tattoos, before the silence. "Because the walls are strong, and the people inside never let go of the door." He looked down at Maya, and for a fleeting second, the Mafia boss vanished. The hardness in his jaw dissolved, replaced by a look of such profound, quiet longing that Samara felt like she was looking at a ghost. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a stray braid away from Maya's forehead. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated tenderness, a lullaby without words. In that moment, the tattoos on his neck didn't look like symbols of power. They looked like scars, armor he had grown to protect the soft, vulnerable boy who had once loved her in the rain. He was a man divided, his soul trapped beneath the weight of his own empire. Yet here, in the presence of a child who didn't know his name carried a death sentence, he was simply Do-Yoon. Samara leaned against the cool stone of the doorframe, her anger flickering but failing to ignite. She had come to find a monster she could hate, but instead, she had found a man trying to remember how to breathe. As he began to hum a melody she hadn't heard in years, she realized the greatest danger in this golden bastion wasn't the enemies at the gate. It was the possibility that the man she had lost was still worth finding. The sanctuary of the library felt like a distant memory the moment Do-Yoon stepped into the grand boardroom. The air here was different, colder, stripped of the scent of old books and replaced by the sterile, metallic edge of filtered oxygen and unspoken threats. At the center of the long, obsidian table sat the Council of Elders, men whose faces were maps of scars and ancient betrayals. They did not see the man who hummed lullabies. They saw a leader whose recent actions looked dangerously like a lapse in judgment. "The girl is a liability, Do-Yoon," the eldest member rasped, his voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. He didn't look up from the file spread before him, a dossier on Samara Ellington that reduced her life to a series of debts, shifts, and a lack of pedigree. "A waitress, an outsider. You have brought a candle into a hurricane and expected us to shield the flame." Do-Yoon didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, his silhouette sharp against the panoramic windows that overlooked the city he ruled. The morning light caught the dark ink on his neck, making the dragons appear to writhe. "She is not a candle," Do-Yoon replied, his voice a low, vibrating cord of steel. "She is the reason I have something worth fighting for. And in this world, a man who has nothing to lose is a man who can be bought. A man with a family is a man who will burn the world to protect it." A murmur of dissent rippled through the elders. To them, Samara was a target, a soft spot in the armor of their organization. They saw her green jacket and her daughter's backpack as neon signs for their enemies. "Our rivals see her as your throat, waiting to be cut," another elder challenged, leaning forward. "How do you propose to prove she is an asset and not a grave?" Do-Yoon leaned over the table, his palms flat against the cold stone. The vulnerability Samara had seen in the library was gone, replaced by a terrifying, focused clarity. "By making her untouchable, I am not merely sheltering her, I am crowning her. If any of you, or any of our enemies, mistake her kindness for weakness, you will find that the woman who survived the streets alone is far more resilient than the men who hide behind bodyguards." He looked each man in the eye, asserting a dominance that had been forged in blood. "She is the new face of this house. You will treat her with the reverence of a queen, or you will answer to the king who put her there. The council is dismissed." As they filed out, their silence was heavy with a new kind of respect, tinged with fear. Do-Yoon remained in the empty room, his chest heaving slightly. He had drawn the line in the sand. He had claimed her before the world, but as he looked at the dossier on the table, he knew the hardest part wasn't convincing the elders. It was convincing Samara that she belonged in a world that wanted to consume her. The clinical silence of the kitchen was broken only by the rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against a pot. Samara had taken over the stove, refusing the services of the estate staff. She needed the steam, the heat, and the familiar sting of chopped chilies to ground her in a world that felt increasingly like a hall of mirrors. As the scent of spicy beef stew, rich with garlic and memories, began to fill the air, the door creaked open. Do-Yoon entered, looking weary, the sharp lines of his boardroom armor softened by the fading light. He sat at the island, watching her move with a quiet intensity. For a long time, the only sound was the bubbling of the broth. Finally, Samara set a bowl in front of him, the steam rising between them like a veil. "You used to make this when it rained," he said softly, his voice thick with a nostalgia that made Samara's hand tremble as she held her own spoon. "I made it because it was cheap and it kept us warm," she replied, her voice steady but guarded. "And I kept making it after you left because I thought if the smell drifted far enough, you'd find your way back, but you never did." Do-Yoon stared into the deep red of the stew, his face reflected in the surface. "I didn't leave because I wanted a throne, Samara. I left because my father's enemies had found us. They didn't see a girl I loved, they saw a bargaining chip. They told me that if I stayed, they would burn down the apartment with you inside just to send a message to the Kwon family." Samara froze, the spoon halfway to her mouth. The anger that had been her fuel for years suddenly felt like ash. "I had to become the monster to keep the other monsters away from your door," he continued, finally looking up, his dark eyes shimmering with a truth he had carried in silence. "I made a deal. I would return to Seoul, I would take up the mantle I hated, and in exchange, they would forget you existed. I spent every night for the first year staring at the phone, dying to hear your voice, but knowing that every word I spoke to you was a nail in your coffin." The weight of the sacrifice settled in the room, heavier than the golden walls surrounding them. It wasn't a choice between her and power. It was a choice between her life and his presence. The abandonment she had nursed like a wound was actually the greatest act of protection he had ever performed. Samara reached across the marble, her fingers brushing the dark ink on his hand, the dragons he had worn to scare away the world. The stew went cold between them, but for the first time in years, the frost around her heart began to melt. They weren't just a boss and a waitress anymore. They were two people who had been surviving a war they never asked to fight. The peace of the kitchen was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, violent vibration that rattled the bowls of cooling stew. Then came the sirens, a low, rhythmic pulse that bled through the reinforced walls, turning the golden light of the estate into a strobe of crimson warning. The breach was instantaneous. From the panoramic windows of the upper floors, the sound of shattering glass echoed like a gunshot, signaling that the untouchable fortress had been compromised. Do-Yoon was on his feet before the first alarm had finished its cycle. The warmth of the domestic moment vanished, replaced by a cold, tactical precision. He reached into the waistband of his trousers, pulling a sleek black handgun with a fluidity that made Samara's stomach roll. "The basement vault," he commanded, his voice no longer the rasp of a grieving lover but the bark of a general. "Go, now." Samara didn't move. She could hear the heavy thud of boots on the marble foyer and the staccato rhythm of suppressed gunfire echoing from the stairwell. Her first instinct was to run, to grab Maya and find a door, any door, that led back to her old life. But as she looked at Do-Yoon, she saw the terror in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. He was standing between her and the door, a solitary figure of ink and steel, prepared to face a tide of violence he had spent years trying to keep away from her. "Samara, move!" He roared as a flashbang detonated somewhere in the hallway, the light blindingly white. She felt the air pressure change as the kitchen door was kicked open. A man in tactical gear, his face obscured by a dark mask, leveled a rifle toward them. In that heartbeat, the world slowed. Samara saw the way Do-Yoon didn't even check his own cover. He simply stepped directly into the line of fire to shield her body with his own. It was a moment of absolute clarity. Her pride, her anger, her desire to remain independent of his chaos, it all fell away. If she didn't trust him now, none of them would see the morning. She didn't head for the back exit. Instead, she lunged for Maya, scooping the child into her arms, and retreated toward the reinforced panic room behind the pantry, following the path Do-Yoon had cleared. As she reached the heavy steel door, she looked back. Do-Yoon was a blur of motion, engaging the intruders with a ferocity that was both terrifying and magnificent. He was the monster he had claimed to be, but he was her monster. Samara slammed the vault lever shut, the sound of the locking bolts a final, heavy punctuation. For the first time, she wasn't hiding from him. She was relying on him to be the shield he had promised to be. The estate was a battlefield, but as the muffled sounds of war continued outside, Samara held her daughter and waited for the man who had sacrificed everything to find his way back to them once more. The smoke from the firefight still hung in the air like a bitter fog, stinging the back of Samara's throat as the heavy vault doors finally hissed open. Do-Yoon stood in the wreckage of the hallway, his white shirt stained with oil and dust, his breathing ragged. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and realized he couldn't keep the darkness from leaking through the cracks. He didn't come closer. He remained near the shattered remains of a marble pedestal, as if afraid the violence clinging to his skin might contaminate her. In his hand, he held a thick, unmarked envelope and a set of keys. "The breach tonight was just a whisper of what's coming," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual melodic strength. "The council is restless, and my enemies have realized that as long as you are here, I have a heart they can pierce." He stepped forward just enough to lay the envelope on a nearby table. "There is a car waiting in the underground garage. It will take you to a private airfield. From there, you fly to Switzerland. New names, new records, and enough wealth to ensure Maya never has to know the scent of a kitchen or the fear of a locked door. You can be Samara Ellington again, not the woman I claimed, but the woman who is free." Samara looked at the envelope, then back at him. The golden bastion had been breached, and the man who had built it was trying to dismantle it for her sake. He was offering her the one thing she had spent years screaming for, a way out. He was willing to return to his solitary throne, to the ink and the iron, just to ensure she never had to see a rifle leveled at her child again. "You're sending us away," she whispered. "Again." "No," Do-Yoon corrected, a single, sharp flash of pain crossing his features. "This time, I'm giving you the choice I never gave you years ago. I'm giving you the world. I will stay here and finish this. I will burn every bridge until they have no way to reach you. It's the only way I can guarantee you'll wake up tomorrow without looking over your shoulder." He turned away, his shoulders slumped as he prepared to walk back into the battlefield of his life. He was ready to be the monster again, to be the ghost, who existed only for the sake of his empire's survival. He was letting her go because he loved her more than he loved his own redemption. Samara looked at the door leading to the garage, then at the man standing alone in the ruins of his house. The choice was a jagged edge. She could take the gold and the safety, or she could stay and face a storm that might never end. The heavy silence that followed Do-Yoon's offer felt more oppressive than the gunfire. Samara looked at the keys, then at the man who had spent a decade turning himself into a weapon just to keep her safe from the shadows. The easy choice lay in that envelope, a life of quiet mornings, safety, and the erasure of every scar he had ever left on her heart. But as she looked at him standing in the ruins of his foyer, she saw the truth. He wasn't a king ruling an empire. He was a man holding up a collapsing ceiling so she could run out of the building. She didn't reach for the keys. Instead, she took a step toward him, her scuffed boots crunching on the broken marble. "You think my identity is something you can just rewrite with a new passport," she said, her voice echoing with a newfound authority. "But I stopped being just a waitress the second I called your name. I'm the woman who raised a child alone, the woman who survived your silence, and the woman who just watched you bleed for us. You don't get to decide when my story ends." She reached out, her hand covering the dragon ink on his arm, anchoring him to the present. "I'm not running, Do-Yoon. A name isn't just a sound, it's a responsibility. You carried mine for 10 years. Now I'll carry yours." This story serves as a powerful testament to the fact that our past is not a prison, but a foundation. It teaches us that true power doesn't come from the titles we hold or the wealth we amass, but from the courage to remain human when the world freezes around us. Do-Yoon thought his tattoos made him a monster, and Samara thought her green jacket made her small. In the end, they discovered that identity is forged in the moments we choose to stay when it would be easier to run. It reminds us that no matter how much we change, The core of who we are is defined by the people we are willing to protect and the truths we are brave enough to speak. The Korean Mafia boss was a title the world gave him, and single mom was a label the world gave her. But in that shattered hallway, they were simply two souls reclaiming their names and a future they had earned through fire. Samara stood her ground against a king. Would you have the courage to confront your past? Drop a yes in the comments and subscribe to the channel if you'd stay, and share this with a friend who loves a story of unbreakable bonds. Thank you for your support. See you in the next video.